Hi, this is Angela from Ascended World, bringing you element 5 of the Course in Guidance and Hidden Messages out of the program Adventures in Wonderland. Today, we're talking about interpretations of our guidance and messages. And that sometimes is where we stop short. So, we've talked about, what is guidance, the ego versus expanded consciousness, what it's not versus, meaning expectations, what our limitations are. And interpretations are important because it's very important to be able to understand what the guidance is saying to you. And so this is what I do. This is what I've just learned to do, because first of all, we have work to do on worthiness. So go back to course 1 if you haven't done that. We have issues to do with challenges to do with worthiness, because if we don't believe that we're worthy of getting clear message, and then we'll continue to block it from ourselves, or we'll get a warped message that we interpret in a way that might not be the most on point for us, right? And we are so quick to ask other people, because that's what we've just trained ourselves to do, is, yeah, I'm gonna ask this person to give me the interpretation. Like, what do you think that means? And then that goes through the filter, but then there's translations, which is tomorrow, but it goes through the filter of their reality or their understanding. So then they interpret it, and it might not necessarily be what the interpretation is supposed to be, right? So if you look at since I know you looked at the workbook, right? The pre-video prompt, I know how to interpret my guidance from expanded consciousness, and I can do so easily without outside influence. So how did that feel? Because we often say, I know how to interpret my guidance from expanded consciousness, but outside influence is usually a big influence, because other people might give us, excuse me, there it is, the yawn, the message. And so we aren't sure, or we doubt ourselves, right, on what it could mean, right? Especially when we get to messages like dreams, since we get very flowery with our self messages that way. One example that I can give you is, I had one for years since I was a kid, and it had to do with the Amityville Horror House. Long story about that. But anyway, I would have the dream over and over again that I was Kathy Lutz, and because I read the book at a very young age, probably when it was a little young to be reading it. But for years, I had this weird connection with all that, and it just stopped, and occasionally it would come back. And not too long ago, I actually had a dream where had rented a house because I was having some big party at Thanksgiving, and we needed extra space. And I walk into the house with my kids to, get set up, and I realized, wait, this house it's familiar. Yeah, because it's the house, but it was me. Like, I wasn't Kathy Lutz. This time it was me, and my kids were with me, my adult kids. And I was like, oh, it's so, like, it was so abandoned. It feels so empty or sleepy, and it's not been taken care of. And I felt like sad about it, not scared or anything. Although I was like a little nervous, like, is it going to wake up while we're doing this? So I go through this whole thing, I showed my kids around, and then I was like, oh, let's clean it up. It deserves to be cleaned up. And then I woke up and I was like, well, what is that about? That was so bizarre. And so what I did was, I actually went into meditation, and I said, okay, this is all me giving a message to me. And when I do that, I'm going to say, okay, I'm the house just as much as I'm me in the dream, right? So if I'm the house, let me embody myself as the house and ask, what was the message I was giving to myself as the house? And it was like immediate. It came to me. It was like, well, it's all about the shadow side. Well, like, duh, right? And it's like, don't forget that the shadow side is so powerful and an important part of our messages, which we will talk about in later on in the course, as well as the shadow course itself in month 6. So, there's interpretations. A lot of times it's like, let me step into this, because like our mind tries to kick in, and when the mind kicks in, the ego kicks in, which then puts a filter. And so it's like, okay, interpretations would be, I can also see things from multiple perspectives. And often when it's something that's outside of our purview, you can freak out a little bit if you're like nervous about a certain message, right? because that's the ego that goes, oh my gosh, that means there's something to be scared of. Or, like I've had messages before, like, okay, like there was one I had several months back that was like, okay, so there's something coming up that's very important, and you are gonna really, it's really going to be important for you to trust. Which right away threw up this red flag by the ego, going, what does that mean? Does it mean it's going to be horrible? Like what? Da, da, da. And it just sort of came up. It just came up, and I was like, oh, and yeah, it was intense, but it wasn't really worth the energy to be nervous about. Like I did sort of quell it, and I said, you know what? I'm going to just put it on the shelf, and I'm going to come back. And sometimes we don't have the interpretations right away. Sometimes it takes, as I think I said before, we have holographic view at the expanded consciousness level. So, I mean, through dimensions, through the different parts of our consciousness and stuff that put together the bigger picture. And when we do that, we when we look at the holographic picture, then we can see it all put together. But often we get our messages and pieces and parts to put the holograph together because we're very linear in our mind here, this part of our consciousness that's embodied. So when we do that, we miss a part of we miss the interpretation of the bigger picture. So what I always tell people is journal about it, keep and know that you have the answer. You don't have to ask anybody else, because then you start getting through extra filtration and translations is the next element down the road here. But when we sit with the interpretation ourselves, then it's going to be, okay, I'm going to put this on the shelf because I don't have context for it right now. And this is what I do. It makes it really easy. I'm going to journal about it. I'm going to have that sort of set in my memory. I'm going to put it on the shelf. And then as other things come in, then I can start to see the hologram. And it took me a long time to realize that it's more of a hologram than anything else, because I mean, how could we, if we're looking at things from expanded consciousness, we're not just looking at them here, we're looking at them at the bigger picture. So to interpret it is to really pull all the pieces and parts of the facets of the hologram of the message before we can get a clearer interpretation. Now, can we interpret parts of it? Yes. But we also have to know that there is going to be a margin for, I don't want to say error, but margin for non-understanding, right? As we haven't had all the pieces come together yet. So the biggest part is knowing that you have the answer. And the more we ask for others to give it to us, then we get lost in forgetting to ask, is that my truth, and all that kind of stuff. So instead, it's really important to get into the habit of listening to it within ourselves, or interpreting, or asking to interpret it within ourselves. Because when we do embody, okay, if you see a color, I'm going to embody that color, and I'm going to remember as that color is me, and I'm going to remember what that message is of what it's trying to provide. And you might not get context for it, which is what I'm talking about. And that's when you say, okay, well, this is what it felt like. I'm going to journal about it. I'm going to put it on the shelf. And then eventually at some point you're like, oh, wait, this feels like it's connected to this. And you start to connect the dots. I look at it as sort of a fun puzzle, just saying. So today's clearing statement: I'm ready, willing, and able to interpret my holistic expanded consciousness guidance freely and without exception. I easily interpret my guidance independently and without influence. So take a deep breath, close your eyes, open your heart, step out of separation and back into oneness as we hold ourselves in the vibration where this is our truth. This is from where we exist, create, and experience. All right. Well, that was pretty explosive. I'm not sure why, but it felt really nice. Almost like we opened up the library or something like that. Yeah, that's what comes to me. Okay, so today's affirmation: I interpret my guidance from expanded consciousness easily, clearly, and in authentic understanding to me. So, stay with that, get comfortable with it before moving on to the next one, which is translating the messages. So have a great one. And thank you for joining me.